Good evening, and let me welcome you to what promises to be an exciting, stimulating, and hopefully educational evening. My name is Peter Johannessen. I am an assistant professor of public policy here at the Batten School. Tonight's program, Democracies in Crisis, is part of a series of events co-sponsored by the University of Virginia's Center for Politics and the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. This national symposium series, titled Democracy in Perilous Times, asks the questions that are at the very core of our national identity. How do we sustain the health and endurance of a democracy? Our esteemed panel we have here today is really quite impressive. So Michael J. Abramowitz is president of Freedom House. Before joining Freedom House in February 2017, he was the director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education. He led the museum's genocide prevention efforts and later oversaw its public education programs. Before that, he was national editor and then White House correspondent for the Washington Post. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former fellow at the German Marshall Fund and the Hoover Institute. A graduate of Harvard College, he is also a board member of the National Security Archive. Dr. Christopher Sabatini is senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, and up until this past December, he was a lecturer in discipline at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, where he has taught since 2008. His areas of expertise include democracy and human rights, foreign policy in the region, social inclusion, resource extraction and community rights, Venezuela, and Cuba. Chris has testified multiple times before the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2015, Chris founded and directed a new research nonprofit, Global Americas, and edited its news and opinion website. Before that, he was director for the Latin America and Caribbean at the National Endowment for Democracy and a diplomacy fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, working at the U.S. Agency for International Development's Center for Democracy and Governance. And perhaps most importantly, he has a PhD in government from the University of Virginia. Professor Vivin Sadaka serves as the chair for the Global Politics and Security concentration in Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program and is a professor of the practice of international affairs in MSFS. Ms. Bibin Sadaka has held numerous positions in the public and non-governmental sectors in the US and Ecuador. She served for 10 years in the United States Department of State, working on democracy promotion, human rights, human trafficking, religious freedom, refugees, and counterterrorism. Ms. Bibin Sadaka holds a master's degree from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a bachelor's degree in international relations from the College of William and Mary, where she was a presidential and Monroe Scholar. She serves as the chairperson of the board of the International Justice Mission, a non-governmental organization fighting human trafficking and violence against the poor. So please give our panelists a warm Virginia welcome. So we have a lot of ground to cover this evening, so let's just jump right in. So starting left to right, or my left to right. What's the current state of democracy in the world? Starting with small questions here.
So you're starting with me?
Starting with you.
That was not what I thought was expected, so I'm going to have to wing this one. At the risk of sounding pessimistic, I think we're reached troubled times, democracy, for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, the consensus around democracy that led Francis Fukuyama to declare the end of history has eroded, if not frayed entirely. Part of that is due to the rise of non-democracies that have done a very good job of lifting people out of poverty, like China, that have presented for the first time sort of an alternative, if you will, to what was sought as the consensus around markets and freedom and transparency and liberty as key to be able to create sustainable economic development and to lift people out of poverty. Suddenly you had China, totalitarian regime that managed to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. One of the most successful modern cases, poverty reduction under totalitarian government. That was my
That was the Chinese.
That was the Chinese. The lights are going to go down pretty soon.
You said fake news. The second is the rise of populism, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is one of the questions. But we're seeing for a variety of reasons, and I'll define populism later, populism of the left and the right. This convergence, very, if you will, sort of sinister convergence of growing distrust in politics, oftentimes fueled by the media, fueled by partisanship, fueled by technology, to a certain extent. Oh, thank you.
Okay, turn this off, and I'm going to sing karaoke. Fueled by a sinister convergence of distrust of politicians, growing dislike of political elites, also a disalignment of political parties and their ideologies, whereas before social democrats and Christian Democrats, sort of the center left and the center right, tended to dominate politics, have effectively vanished. Political parties have become unmoored from their traditional ideological posts or leanings. And then second of all, there's obviously a growing sense of frustration, sense of fear, caused by economic dislocation, caused by alienation, caused by a sense of the loss of nationhood that is feeding, if you will, the growth of populism. And I'll talk a little bit later about what populism is, but what this means is that the typical sort of discourse and the typical sort of soft barriers towards respect for opposing opinions, respect for the checks and balances of power have vanished. And that's had implications not just in domestic politics, say in the United States or Brazil or even Mexico or Venezuela certainly, but it's also had implications for the global systems, global sense of norms and processes and institutions that at one time were designed and created post-World War II to defend and protect human rights, and then later in the 1990s to defend and protect democracy. And so we've seen those, the consensus and legitimacy of those vanish with this rise of populism in places like Hungary or Poland. So I'll leave it there. But the short answer is, I'm pessimistic about democracy right now. Sorry.
My turn. Following on that, thank you for having us here. It's wonderful to be at UVA and to be in this conversation. I agree 100% with everything that Chris said. I would add two other points to it. First, we are also, as we're seeing the trends that Chris identified, we're also seeing traditional democracy supporting nations, the United States and Western Europe, turning inward and focusing on their own democratic challenges at home, some of which is this polarization that Chris talked about. And so they are focusing far less of their time doing what they have done for the last 40 or 50 years, which is to support democracy outside of their country as well as at home. And so this lack of good example and this lack of foreign policy driven by democratic values has also left less checked or under-checked the behavior of Russia and China and of those other authoritarian leaders that would seek to do undemocratic things. I agree that there is a democratic recession by all accounts, but I am a little bit more optimistic for the reason that while we're seeing all of these significant trends of reversals, we're also seeing a lot of people going to the street saying, this is what I want. If you do look at the case of Hong Kong, where people do have a choice between the Chinese system and democracy, they are saying and courageously saying, in ways which I'm not sure that all of us would have the courage to do face to face every day, they're saying that we would rather have a democratic system. So what that tells me is we are unquestionably in a time of democratic recession, but it is not democracy that, the concepts of democracy necessarily that have been outlived or are now outdated. They remain a compelling case and what most people in the world still long to have. It's just that the forces that would like to put democracy in the rearview mirror are just strengthening their game. And the response to that has to be those who believe in democracy, those who recognize the importance of it, have to get in the game at a much more assertive way than we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years.
So, first of all, you're making a big mistake with this panel because you found people who basically violently agree with each other. But let me just say, I would probably associate my own feelings with kind of what Nicole just said, which is that democracy is going through a rough patch right now, but that I'm ultimately optimistic about its future because it really is the only system that that makes sense. As Churchill said, it's the worst system except for all the others. Let me tell you just a bit about Freedom House. I'm the president of Freedom House. I don't know how much people here know about it, but we are probably the oldest pro-democracy organization in the United States. We were founded in 1941. And since the early 70s, we have published an annual ranking of political rights and civil liberties in the world. I mean, we rank every country in the world and territories for their adherence to basic liberal democratic principles: free elections, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, rule of law, transparency. There's a whole range of things that we've looked at. So we have a pretty good sense of the general trajectory of this issue. And the basic story that our reports show over the last 50 years or so is that the first 35 years, democracy was in a huge bull market, if you will. It was what Samuel Huntington, the political scientist, termed the third wave of democracy. And you saw Latin American dictatorships become democracies. You saw the Berlin Wall fall. And you really saw an incredible burst of democratization, which kind of halted about 10 to 15 years ago. And we can talk about the reasons that it's halted. But I think just one important contextual point for this discussion is that we're still way ahead of where we were at the end of World War II. There are, I think 120 or so democracies in the world. And, even though there's been a recession, as Nicole said, I still think this is the predominant system of government, if you put aside China, in the world. But our reports in the last 10 to 15 years show a very disturbing trend. So every year for the last 15 years, there are more countries that are suffering a decline in political rights and civil liberties, a decline, if you will, in the strength of their democracy, as opposed to those that are having an improvement. Last year, our scores are going to come out in a few weeks, so I can't give you last year's scores, but I think the basic trend is going to endure. I think you see democracy sort of weakening all around the world. First of all, you've got countries, I would say the two major authoritarian states, China and Russia, which maybe 15 or 20 years ago we thought were liberalizing. They are moving really decidedly into that kind of the autocratic camp. And not only are they repressing people within their own countries, they are also trying to export and undermine democracy beyond their borders. Then you have major regional powers, and the kind of countries that come to mind here are Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela, a few others that have really suffered a substantial erosion in the rule of law, democratic norms over the last 15 years. And then you have the third phenomenon, which Nicole alluded to, which is you have traditionally strong democracies, like the countries in Western Europe, the United States, a number of others, that are also experiencing a weakening of their democratic standards. So you have a lot of things going on. But I think it's a global phenomenon. And I was just struck by a poll that I saw just last week by these major researchers coming out of England, which found that there was actually a weakening attachment to the idea of democracy all over the world by people. And they did a sort of an international poll. So that's very concerning. I want to end on a more positive note, however, which is that in the last year or two, you have seen some very significant openings that, candidly, you would not have expected. And I'll give you like one or two examples. One country that I think a lot about is Sudan. This is a country that for 30 years had been an entrenched dictatorship. The leader of the country of Sudan had been accused of conducting genocide in Darfur. Really a bad guy. And last year, you saw basically a rebellion that was led by people, by doctors, by professional groups who were just disgusted with the corruption and the lack of economic progress, and basically Bashir, the president, was overthrown, and he could be on his way to the International Criminal Court. So that is just one example, Hong Kong's another, of how democracy is just, I think, an enduringly appealing concept to average people. It's not a Western construct. You see people interested in democracy all over the world, and that is a very powerful message, and we should not forget that even amidst the gloom.
So Mike, I'd like to follow up on that. It seems like Sudan's a real bright spot, but what are some of the other countries which have had the largest rises or falls in their scores over the past 10 years?
I would say, let me pick 2 or 3 countries that I think we've been very concerned about in our scores. A big one would be Turkey. Turkey has had, I think, one of the biggest drops in democratic practice for the last 10 years. President Erdogan is notorious for his proclivity of jailing journalists. There are lots of journalists in jail. There are lots of members of civil society in jail. He enacted laws that allowed him to kind of stay in power for longer. Now, also, though, Turkey is an interesting case because there were domestic elections in Istanbul, and his party was defeated. So, you know, Turkey is in a bad place, but it also is a sign that, you know, even autocrats are vulnerable to the problems that Democrats are, which have to deliver for their people. And there's some question of whether he's going to deliver, whether he's delivering economic for his people. Another country that I would mention, and Chris knows more about this, but is Venezuela. You know, Venezuela was, you know, when Hugo Chavez took over in the 90s, it was one of the stars of democracy in Latin America. It was a very thriving country, and step by step, Chavez and his colleagues really eviscerated democracy in Venezuela, and now it's really, it's not so much a democracy failure, it's just a case of state failure. So I think Venezuela would be one other example. And then I think a third example that I would say would be Hungary. Hungary is a case of what, well, the Prime Minister of Hungary says he's an illiberal Democrat, right? That, and he has kind of systematically rigged the system, bought up a lot of the newspapers, right? His cronies buy up the newspapers and the media, stacked the judicial system, gerrymandered the legislature, so that right now it's really a highly unfair, even though they have elections, in theory, it's just not, they're not real elections there. And he's really tilted the deck in his favor. Hungary has suffered some of the steepest declines in our scores. And in fact, it's the first country in the EU, we group our countries into free, partly free, not free. And Hungary is the first country in Europe, a member of the EU, to go from free to not free in our scores. They crossed into that last year. So those would be 3 examples of countries that we're concerned about.
Aside from Sudan, are there any bright spots?
Yes. I will say they're bright spots. I'll give you a couple bright spots. I keep looking at Africa because I think maybe Africa could lead us out of the democratic recession. Sudan is and by the way, it's not going to be easy. Sudan has a lot of issues on, and there are going to be forces that are going to be pushing back against this. I think another interesting country in this respect is Ethiopia, one of the largest countries in Africa, very economically significant. And this kind of came out of nowhere, where the ruling party there basically installed, a young Prime Minister Abiy into power, and he became kind of like a Gorbachev. He released prisoners, he sought peace with Eritrea, and he's kind of opened up the space. And Ethiopia over the last 2 years has been one of the most dramatic success stories on democracy. I'll give you 2 others on the success side. In Asia, Malaysia, last year they threw out the ruling party for the first time in 60 years. The big issue there was corruption. I think that's an Achilles heel for some of these autocratic countries. And then another country is Burma, or Myanmar. Very interesting. You know, the military dictatorship gave up power to some extent. Aung San Suu Kyi became the de facto ruler of Myanmar. Now, I think what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, you know, some backsliding from that improvement. And what we're very concerned about with Burma is the ethnic cleansing, which has accelerated in Burma, and basically Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been kind of a hero of the human rights world, has basically defended or turned a blind eye to the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. 700,000 ethnic Muslims basically being booted out of Burma.
So then it seems for some of these negative cases, such as Hungary and Venezuela, populism is this uniting element. So, Chris, can you define what populism is? And can you explain why populist candidates have seen this sort of surge today? How are they winning elections?
So a lot of ink has been spilled trying to define populism and talk about it, going back all the way, of course, to the populist movements in the United States, going back all the way to, obviously, Juan Perón and others. Basically, populism at its most fundamental, and there's a great book by Jan Werner Mueller, who's a professor at Princeton, about what is populism. In fact, that's the title of the book. And he very beautifully articulates what populism is, in the sense that it is the denial of pluralism. It is the failure to accept that there could be a diversity of views that differ from a political leader, and that leader, because he or she represents the anger of a population against a political elite, oftentimes growing out of fear and alienation, that leader then represents the political will, embodies, if you will, the political will. And that when a leader claims or believes, and many of his or her followers believe that they represent the political will, there can be no checks on that leader's power. That therefore, it is the political will. No Congress, no courts, no civil society, no media can dare question the political will. That is, in many ways, the embodiment of populism. And it's neither left nor right. And we saw this actually in the case of Italy, where you had the Five Star Movement and the Conservative League share a government. They came from the populist left and the populist right. We see a populist president of Mexico of the left. We see a populist president of Brazil of the far right. We see the populists of Hungary of the far right. Now, why did these emerge? And I talked about it briefly, but in many ways, what they're doing is tapping into a sense of dislocation, a fear that people have about their economic futures, fears that people have about their culture being invaded. Oftentimes, we can say they're unfounded, but those fears are very genuine and real, and tapping into a sense of that people have gotten shafted. Somehow that economically and politically, they have not been represented. And in many ways, populism is the exact opposite of representative democracy. It's not necessarily a demand for no democracy. It's a demand for direct democracy. It's a demand for people to have a direct voice in politics through plebiscites, through referenda, through basically voting in office a leader that they believe represents their will, and he or she can then do whatever they want. And so, as Jan Werner Mueller says, basically populism is always in the shadow of representative democracy, because it does reflect frustration in times of stress, with the slowness and the lack of sense of connection that people often have with representative democracy. But in that sense, it exists in very, very strong tension with liberal democracy. And it exists in very, very strong tension with the idea of having an educated, technocratic, professional political class. Because when you're angry with your political elite, when you believe anyone can govern better than those that are up at the top, you're automatically, it's a prescription for bad policy. And so there's also very much an implication for declining effective government in populism.
I could just add a couple things to Chris's great definition. I'm going to get that book when I get home.
It's a good read. It made me jealous. Like, I wanted to write this book.
Yeah. I mean, I think we also have to look at what are the things that are happening in a society that allows a populist leader to step in and take advantage of that moment. Because there have been populist leaders, as Chris said, for many, many years. It's not something that just started a year ago or 3 years ago or 10 years ago. There have always been populists who've been trying. We just have a ripe soil right now for them to sow their seeds. And there are a number of different things. So economic dislocation is certainly one of them. The fact that we're seeing shifts in markets because of technology, of automation, of a number of different things means that our traditional economic structures look different now. And when there is a scarcity of something, what do? We look to the other as the problem. That is human nature and has been forever. And so when there's a scarcity of economic resources, people tend to blame somebody else for that problem, which gives a fertile space for populists to step in. Likewise, we're seeing a significant increase in the movement of people. We have the largest population of refugees globally than we've had in recent history, and we have a significant amount of migration, non-refugee migration, just economic migration, which means that there are people coming from a lot of different places, which means there are a lot of others getting together in places. And when you have that phenomenon as well, it also offers an ideal way for populists to step in and to talk about some of these dynamics of cultural differences or other differences, which gives them a ripe other to target. And so I think along with the points that Chris said, we have to look at some of these other global trends that are happening, which are just providing this foundation for populist leaders to step in and create a story which is resonating with some people that right now are feeling under stress.
Yeah.
Mike, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that you've discussed it intelligently. I mean, I think the issue is, from our perspective, there's nothing wrong in theory with a political party trying to be more responsive to the people. I mean, that's politics. Really though, the question is, what do you do with that power? Mm-hmm. And I think, again, to use the case of Hungary, you have a political leader who has, who took power democratically, but then using this populist playbook that Chris and Nicole have been talking about, and then been able to manipulate the levers of power so that he has basically eliminated opposition. So that's really what we're worried about. It's not that we're against. I mean, we want robust elections, but I think an important point is that elections are not sufficient for a functioning of a successful democracy. You have to have a free press so that the government can be held accountable. You have to have a rule of law and a functioning court system. You have to have freedom of association so that people can band together to raise their concerns to the government. So democracy only works when you not only have those elections, but when you have these things that make elections successful, and that's what we're measuring at Freedom House.
If I can just say one thing, again, not to be the pessimist or the skunk of the garden party here, but as we're talking, I'm trying to think of a system that underwent a populist government in which it sort of turned the corner after that populist government. I believe the only way out of democratic recession or democratic decline is more democracy. No one is actually, what's interesting now is the days of the traditional military coup are largely over. We're not going to see that happen. The days of traditional revolution, the Bolshevik revolution, are not going to happen. But what we don't really, so democracy remains a desire that is universal, I think, largely. Even for populist supporters, they want more democracy. But I can't think of a situation in a case of a populist government in which the country's been able to turn the corner afterwards. I think of Juan Perón, it took the military to unseat him. I'm not arguing for military coups, don't get me wrong. I think of Brazil was Getulio Vargas. I mean, it took, in that case, obviously a very wrenching change. Because how do you recover institutions of the rule of law? How do you recover free and fair elections and trust in political elites? How do you recover free and dynamic press? I don't know. I think it can be done. I think it has to be done. But there really is no clear roadmap today, as there was, say, at the end of the Cold War when basically democracy was blossoming everywhere and there were democratic transitions and we had a pretty good sense. We don't have that now. We don't.
And so the note of pessimism here is really astounding, because if we were here a few years ago and we were in the midst of the Arab Spring, we would be extremely optimistic. And one thing we would be talking about is the role of technology. Just a few years ago, everyone thought that technology was going to play this real democratizing role in the world, whether through social networks, which would allow people to overcome authoritarian regimes, or through other mechanisms. But what we've seen is technology has started playing this really negative role in lots of democracies, whether facilitating ethnic cleansing or leading to the spread of fake news in Brazil and other countries. So I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on the role of technology in democracies these days, and whether it still has any positive role to play. And I guess we'll start with you, Nicole.
Yeah, I think technology is a tool, and every tool can be used in any way, right? I think we tend to, when there's a new tool, we think, oh, this is going to be a good thing or it's going to be a bad thing, right? The internet has a lot of good stuff. It also has a lot of bad stuff, right? And so every tool, every new technological development, we have to see it's a question of how is it being used by a society, how is it being used by individuals, and that brings the point of individual agency. So I'm a little less pessimistic, and now we're going to be in slightly violent disagreement. But I believe in that sort of the human agency in using tools or in using democracy or reversing populism, that there is individual agency, but we have to be cognizant of it. I think the challenge that we have right now with technology is that it is being used by authoritarians extraordinarily effective to do what authoritarians have done for many, many years, just to do it a different way. So they are limiting the speech of their civil society members. They are closing space for dialogue and debate. They are doing they're tracking citizens' movement and following people through technology. So they are using it effectively, but I think in the West, not in the West, but in democratic countries, we need to think not just how do we use technology for ordering my groceries or ordering things online, but how are we going to use technology to actively support democratic movements? And there are a lot of organizations that are doing that, but I think we need to think that this is not a neutral on one side, because the other side has considered it an active use of a tool to move their agenda forward. So I think we have to accept that human agency in democratic countries to say we really need to increase how we use technology in order to support democratic movements around the world. And we need to think about the very complex debate about how do we have advances in technology but also maintain the values that we want, including freedom of expression with some limitations, freedom of speech with some limitations, and how we balance that out.
I think in many ways, technology is going to be the defining issue for democracy. I mean, I really worry about this a lot at Freedom House. I do think, as Nicole said, technology can be a very empowering tool. I mean, one reason the protesters in Sudan had such success was they were able to, use social media to rally people, and similar as it was in Tahrir Square in Egypt 9 years ago. And I do think, there are other examples, like in Russia, where YouTube has been one place to enable a spotlight on the corruption of some of the senior officials, like the prime minister there. That said, it does seem to me that on technology, the trends are in really kind of a negative direction. And the country that I really think about this a lot is with China. We do, in addition to our Freedom of the World report, we do a report called Freedom of the Net, which looks at what it's freedom on the internet, access to information, open internet, those questions. China is the single worst violator of internet freedom in the world. And it's interesting because during the Clinton administration, President Clinton spoke very dismissively about the Chinese ability to censor. And he was saying, like, trying to control the internet is going to be like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. And he was wrong. The Chinese have really perfected almost an Orwellian system of internet control. They employ millions of people to basically block out information to the Chinese citizens. They are taking facial recognition and new technologies to new levels so that they can really creating a surveillance state in many parts of China. And then what's even worse is that they're now exporting these tools of technology to other countries. We found in our report last year on Freedom of the Net that China was going to countries like Vietnam and other countries and doing trainings and basically showing other countries how they could, control the internet. So that is a really big challenge for democracy, and we haven't yet figured out that. And so I worry about that. And then the final thing I worry about is, in traditional democracies, as you've seen in our own country, the internet has been proven to be a platform that can be candidly easily manipulated by demagogic forces. And we were exposed in 2016 to election interference from Russia. It's not clear to me that has been, prevented going forward. And we've also, I think it's a vehicle for extremists of all parties to really peddle really false information about what's happening. Just think about what happened after the Iowa caucuses this week. Just really bad information being purposely put out and people not knowing what to believe. And what it does, it kind of undermines, to me, the ultimate danger, that undermines a sense of what the truth is. And people then are not really sure what truth is, and you can't really have a democracy, it seems to me, a strong democracy without some kind of common understanding of truth and facts. So I think in some ways this is a major issue that democratic societies are going to need to really grapple with over the next number of years to maintain a strong democracy. And candidly, I wish I could tell you there was like a silver bullet to it, but I don't have a silver bullet on this one.
I think there is a silver lining here. I'm not just saying this to counteract the perception that I've become a pessimist. There are examples of where technology has helped. Yes, there's a surveillance state. Yes, it's provided new means for dictators to spread propaganda or disinformation. There's a very good article that appeared today in Foreign Affairs called Digital Dictators. But there are these flash moments in which it's played a very positive role. If you look, for example, in Cuba today, the opening of Wi-Fi hotspots and connectivity in Cuba has given Cubans an opportunity to communicate electronically with their counterparts and other students, but also their counterparts and relatives just across the Florida Straits they didn't have, say, 10 years ago. In the case of Colombia, the Farc guerrilla movement, which was infamous for kidnappings and extortion and drug running, popular resentment, opposition to the Farc was largely fragmented and unheard. And it actually took a group of high school students who put together this Farc Facebook group. I needed to make sure I didn't say that wrong. It was a dangerous potential slip there. And gave voice to an entire generation of people who were fed up with this guerrilla group that at the time had over 300 hostages that it was holding for ransom. And because of that, captured a popular voice that really never had one platform to express opposition to this very brutal guerrilla movement that for some reason people outside still had this romantic fascination with because they claimed they were Marxist-Leninists when in fact they were just a group of thugs. That was important, and that really was a turning point in many ways against this guerrilla movement in Colombia. So there are bright spots. I understand the risks, but we also have to understand there have been these flash moments that have been very, very important. The question, as Mike said, is, how do you begin to address? There's no silver bullet, but I think we need to understand what are these downsides.
So as we continue to plumb the depths of our pessimism here, the next question is, do you have confidence that democracy can work in any country? So starting with Mike.
Well, yes.
It has.
All right, let me try to be less pessimistic for a minute. because I tend to be a glass half full kind of guy than a glass half empty kind of guy. But to me, one of the most inspiring stories in democracy in the last year was the story of Taiwan. I'm not sure how much people here have paid attention, but you know, Taiwan 30 years ago was a dictatorship. And there was a lot of commentary that the Chinese are not interested in democracy. It's a Western implant. But Taiwan has become one of the most thriving democracies in the world. You know, so much as last year they even had a same-sex marriage bill that passed. Like, who would have thought that in Taiwan, you know, a while ago? And in this last election, just a few weeks ago, there was incredible pressure on Taiwan from China, electoral disinformation, and really an effort by the Chinese government. And I think it was widely perceived to have backfired. And the people of Taiwan thought it was a real heavy-handed effort by the Chinese to impose you know, their thinking, and the president of Taiwan, who's a very strong Democrat, won re-election. So I really don't intend to be pessimistic, but I think we also have to be clear-eyed about the challenges. I definitely feel that there is less, it's more up to grabs around the world, the notion that I kind of grew up with, that democracy is the best system. I think a real thing for us to kind of push on is the issue of corruption. That, to me, is like the Achilles heel of, and that what you see in a lot of the cases, the success stories that we've talked about, a common theme there is that the governments, the autocratic governments, are found to be corrupt, are found to be, you know, just basically the same governance problems that are out there for everyone to see in a democracy, they're also there in an autocracy. And I think if I had one piece of advice, like for Freedom House, for other human rights groups, for people, I think that's a really good thread to pull on if we're going to kind of push back against democracy. But it's a long-winded way of coming back to your question about, I do think Taiwan's a good example of how, like, you know, people said democracy couldn't happen there. They said it couldn't happen in South Korea. They said it couldn't happen in Japan. But these are some very, very thriving cases of democracy. So I definitely think there's no country in the world that's off limits to that. But I just think we have to be realistic about the way forward, that it's tough.
So I wouldn't put myself in the pessimistic category. I would put myself in the hopeful, realistic category, which, to Mike's point, you have to be clear-eyed and honest about what the challenges are, but also hopeful, if you take a longer-term perspective, that democracy has been winning, and despite the current setbacks, it will continue. If we look back at where the world has been, it's not that long ago that we had a world war in which we had massive genocide throughout Europe. It is not that long ago that this country had a segregated society in which a significant portion of the population could not vote or have access to many economic or political rights. It's not that long ago that most of Latin America was under a dictatorship and run by a military, and everyone said, well, Latin Americans can't have democracy. But now it's an aberration that there are non-democratic countries in the hemisphere, and even Bolivia, which has struggled, is working through a transition of power from a less than democratic leader, but they're working through it in democratic types of ways. They're not out of the woods. But what that is to say that the democratic values have deep roots, I think an important part of it is that we had talked about democracy as a win for a long time. I think we need to talk about it in a more realistic way, which is it is a system. It is not an end state. It's a system which allows us to deal with the most difficult things which any society has. And it is only through democracy that any of those difficult human hardships have been overcome, whether it's military dictatorship or segregation or genocide in society. It's actually been democracy that has overcome those things And we have to talk about it in that way, in large part, so that we're showing that democracy is a hard project. It's not an easy answer that just is a magic wand. And I think when we start to have that more realistic conversation about how it is difficult, those countries that are at an earlier stage of walking through that will realize that it is a hard struggle. It's a call to leaders to step into that. I do think this question about how do we deal with technology and democracy stepping up, that it is not going to be a neutral game that we leave to corporations to decide, but rather it's a tool that we have to aggressively co-opt for democratic purposes, is going to be a really big part of that.
When I was at USAID in the 90s, there was this question about whether there was an Asian values that was antithetical to democracy. I found the debate sterile and useless because, quite frankly, a lot of those countries that we were having the debate had already gone through a transition to democracy. Why have it? People had already demanded democracy. It was, you know, it's a ridiculous academic exercise. I don't mean to question your question because I'm going to get back to it in a second, to say that they're not prepared. And I find it deeply offensive when people have already opted for democracy in the fall of the Berlin Wall, or transitions that swept in South Korea, Taiwan, and other places. You know, people wanted democracy. You know, the question is then how to make it take root and grow. You know, there was a time in the 1960s when political scientist Samuel Huntington concluded and argued that some countries simply weren't ready for democracy. Well, you can't tell people that. If they want freedom, if they want to remove their leaders and opt for elections, it's not our place to tell them they're not ready for democracy. Having said that, though, I do think there are, while I would never say there are preconditions to democracy, there should never be preconditions to democracy. In fact, when the very famous political scientist Alman and Verba conducted their survey on civic culture, they concluded, and this was done in the 50s, that actually by measures of civic culture, Germany and Italy were not going to be very stable democracies. The people didn't have traditions of tolerance and pluralism and respect for differences of opinion and civic engagement. But in fact, those values blossomed under democracy. Democracy is both a means and an end. It's what people aspire to, but it's the way you get there, as Nicole was saying. And that's very important, because in the 1950s, no one would have thought Germany or Italy would have remained democratic. And I come from an Italian-American family, and I'm not even sure my family's democratic. Speaking of disagreements and violently disagreeing. But having said that, there are conditions, not preconditions for democracy, the conditions we need to be aware of that make democracy flourish. And the first one is an effective and functioning state. I'm not talking about a regime. I'm not talking about the processes of checking and balancing power or freedom of expression. I'm talking about the mechanism that establishes the monopoly and the legitimate use of force and that delivers public services. When that fails, when that cannot deliver social safety nets, when it cannot mediate disputes, when it cannot actually provide for stability and security, then democracy is truly at risk. That doesn't mean it's doomed, but it does mean that when people have chosen democracy and there's been a democratic transition in any place from South Korea to Bolivia to South Africa to Ethiopia, we need to look at what is going to be necessary to sustain democracy. I believe democracy is possible anywhere. I just believe you need primarily two things to make it sustain: a functioning state, and within that, a sense of common purpose, a sense of, within the people, of acceptance of diversity, but a common consensus around what is the nation state, and a sense and a tolerance of those divisions. That doesn't mean it has to happen like that, but it does mean that it has to be built up over time. When the various nation state there's no consensus around that, whether it's religious divisions, ethnic divisions, regional divisions, that cannot be resolved within that nation state, then I think democracy is at risk. But that doesn't mean that it can't take root anywhere. Those conditions, though, at a certain point have to develop.
Can I just throw one issue on the table? I don't know if you're planning to ask this, but I do think it's worth thinking a little bit about the role of the United States in the global democratic movement, because some of the comments made me think about this. You know, I think one reason, I believe this in my heart, that one reason for this so-called third wave of democratization was very strong American leadership on these issues. You know, on the Cold War, you know, very firm position in favor of freedom in Eastern Europe that transcended different administrations. And it doesn't mean that, I don't mean to be naive about the United States and the mistakes that we've made in places like Iraq or Vietnam, and I think certainly the United States can be criticized for that. But I think in general, the United States tended to be a very, outwardly looking great power that, did the Marshall Plan and helped form NATO and these institutions that were really important for democracy. And in fact, the American Civil Rights Movement was, I think, inspiring to the rest of the world in this regard, too. People were watching that. And in fact, the State Department, encouraged that because they were embarrassed to go around the world and have to talk about Jim Crow in the South when they were trying to argue against communism. So I do think a big question about the future of democracy is whether the United States is going to be a leader in promoting is not a word I like, but supporting democracy and making this a key part of our foreign policy, and also being exemplar of democratic practice. And like when the rest of the world sees their own politics here in kind of chaos with gerrymandering and excessive influence of money in politics and all the different problems that we've talked about, the polarization in our society, I think it really makes it hard for the rest of the world to take it seriously. And I think that's an important issue for this debate, that I think the United States has to be a leader for democracy to thrive.
Yeah, so let's pick up. So
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I mean, I could not agree more with that. And I also think that it's an important place then where for American citizens get involved in that, right? Because all of us do have opportunities to vote. We all have opportunities to express to our elected members of Congress or to other people that it's not just about democracy at home, but that we want to see an active foreign policy which supports people who are seeking the same things that we have here at home. And we have failed, I think, as citizens to make that a consistent priority of the people that we have elected into office.
By the way, if I could just give a tout to my friend Nicole, she just did a really good report about this very subject for the Bush Institute about the importance of, and I would really recommend people reading it because it really, I think, makes the point very well that we're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind of you. Was not leading towards a personal plug, but I do think that it is the requirement, and I think it is a reminder for all of us that democracy is hard won. It is hard won in the places, and it's only been hard won when people have gone to the streets or the ballot box or to their civic organizations or whatever it is and have taken part and said, this is something important to me. And there are organizations now that are starting to watch how are our elected members voting on support of democracy overseas? To what extent is this a priority for the administration's foreign policy? To what extent is it something that Congress is standing for? And it's an important thing for us as voters, as citizens of the country, to say that this is something that matters to us because there is not a neutral in this arena.
So then in terms of specifics, what would you like to see the United States doing on the world stage to promote democracy? What are some specific measures our country could take?
So I think it would start, I mean, there's what we can do at home and there's what we can do externally. I do think that the United States has to prioritize it in every relationship that we have. I think that the United States has to work more closely with democratic nations to say that this is an actual priority, that it's not just a byproduct that we're going to hope that gets done on the side, but that we're actively going to come together to support countries that are moving forward in democracy and the civil society actors that are courageously going to the streets to ask for that. I think that we need to put our money where our mouth is. There are a lot of great organizations from the United States as well as other countries that are supporting democracy around the world. I do think that we have to remember as the United States, we have the ability to say no to some autocrats. We don't have to be as close to Saudi Arabia. We do not have to be as close to China, even though we're warring with them. We're pretty close to them on a lot of other things. We can stand up consistently to countries that have no desire, to governments that have no desire to represent their citizens. And that is a reflection of the values that our global system is based on and that our domestic system is based on. I do think we have the responsibility to get a lot of things right at home. And we can start cleaning up things at home. I don't think that there's a sequence. I think that we can walk and chew gum and do both at the same time, and that it's incumbent, we're up against a time pressure here, and it's incumbent on us to do both at the same time.
And Chris, what do you think?
I'll just say quickly, I think there are two things, and we've touched on them. One is how we behave domestically, as an example. Not just how we behave outside our borders, but within. We're seeing Orban in Hungary talk about fake news. We're seeing Duterte in the Philippines talk about fake news. And use much of the same language that I think, if it wasn't coined here, certainly has become very common.
It's actually one of the president's greatest exports. We documented last year there were 18 different countries that had imposed new laws restricting the rights of journalists and bloggers in the name of combating fake news. I mean, people do pay attention to what happens here.
Yeah, well, I guess that's one of the areas we don't have a trade deficit,
Yes.
thanks to Trump. In terms of polarization, in terms of the way we talk about and discuss what Steve Levitsky refers as soft guardrails of democracy, we need to be able to embody those here. And we don't. We cannot talk about the benefits of democracy as a country, even as citizens when we travel, and not sort of defend those, what we believe makes it great, the very foundations of it in this country, in our own discourse and our own practice, okay? That also includes voter turnout. It's not just, we send election monitors all over the place to monitor the freeness and fairness of elections. I'm not going to comment on the Iowa caucuses, but clearly we got to get that in place, but we also need to get more people to the polls. The second issue is what we do overseas. And look, human rights, democracy have always been instrumentalized. That's, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan or, we're never going to be as tough on Saudi Arabia, for example, as we are on Cuba. But there needs to be at least some efforts, and I think we've gone backwards in that in two ways. One is you see this administration really, if not going silent, even if not, at times even coddling autocrats in Saudi Arabia and Russia, Erdogan in Turkey.
And praising the exact behavior that is antithetical to our values.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what we do beyond our borders really matters. And the second, our willingness to participate. Mike's not going to plug my writing, but I have no hard feelings there, Mike. But I had a piece once.
I'm happy to do it. Just send it to me, I'll tweet it out.
A piece in Washington Post that I published recently on the inter-American system of human rights, in which Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua have all pulled out of. Well, who's now sort of pulling back and cutting funding to the inter-American system of human rights? The Trump administration. So while we're more than willing to use this inter-American system of human rights to denounce and investigate human rights abuses in Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, the U.S. doesn't want to participate when it criticizes U.S. policies towards immigration or towards the death penalty and the like. We've also pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council because we don't like the direction it's going. In other words, we need to be willing to participate in these international organizations that supposedly, while imperfectly, defend many of the values we claim to stand for. If we're not doing that, if we're not in the game, then we really lose our moral authority to be able to stand up for these values in a consistent way. We won't always do it even-handedly, and I understand that. But by pulling out of them, it sends a signal that basically we're turning the keys over to the autocrats like China and Russia that want to remake the international system.
One hopeful sign, I think, again, I'm looking for some signs of hope. You keep wanting some signs of hope, but I do think it's interesting on the democracy issue, there is a lot of bipartisanship on these issues that we've found at Freedom House. We really work with Republicans and Democrats. Chris used to work at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a really important institution that was created in 1984 by President Reagan and the Congress then. It's a bipartisan organization. It does a lot of incredible work supporting democracy activists all over the world. And there is total bipartisan support for this. And in fact, they just had a major increase in their funding because Lindsey Graham and Patrick Leahy and Kay Granger and Nita Lowey, 2 R's and 2 T's, got together and supported that. And then when you find on things like the murder of Khashoggi, you see incredible bipartisan support for efforts to try to hold the Saudis accountable for that egregious murder. So I do think things like that say to me that this is an issue that does resonates with Americans, and that even though sometimes things get polarized in the executive branch and R's and D's, but in the Congress it says something to me.
Yeah.
So then, before we open up for questions from the audience, I'd like to just ask you, what are your thoughts for the future of democracy in the world? What do you think is going to come next? So, Nicole.
Oh, I get the easy question. I mean, I think that I think we're not done with the recession, because I don't think that those forces that want to divide and push back are done. There's too much at stake for them to stop. And Russia and China and non-democratic forces are not going to just go home because we've had 13 or 14 years. So we're going to see more recession in some countries, but I do think that there is an awakening of some governments, but also civil society and other actors to say there's too much at stake here. The question, I think, is going to be who acts faster and more effectively. I'm hoping that it will be democratic countries. So I think we'll see continued regression in some places, but I do think that you'll see a pushback that will come from civil society forces in some democratic nations that will say enough at some point.
Chris?
I think the fact that we're having discussions like this, and you walk into any bookstore and you look at those shelves, and there is a raft of literature, the decline of democracy and what to do about it. You can't escape it. I think that's very, very healthy. It means that our commitment, our interest, our engagement on this issue is peaking. And I think that's very, very positive. And so if there's first of all, positive note, it's that we realize this. We're not going to give up the fight. The fact that there's so many people here on a pretty lousy night in Virginia certainly demonstrates that as well, that people care and remain engaged. And I'll just end with one last anecdote. I've been teaching for a long time. I'll even count the years that I was teaching here as both a TA and then a lecturer. And in the last 25 years, when I teach a class on political development, I always ask my students how many of them plan to go into politics. And in a class of, say, 50, typically there'd be 2 or 3 hands that would go up. For reasons, politics is tough. I mean, it's not a steady career. I mean, my mother wouldn't have wanted me to go into politics. Now when I ask my students at Columbia, in the last 3 years, how many plan on going into politics in a class of 50? Easily 15 or 20 hands would go up. And we're talking Muslim Americans, Hispanic Americans, and majority women. In other words, there is a rejuvenation in the United States, at least in terms of engagement in politics, for all the problems that we've talked about, that demonstrates that people recognize what's wrong and they want a seat at the table and they want to correct it. And I think that will both help, and if I may sound so brazenly patriotic, in terms of reestablishing the United States as sort of as a shining city on the hill for democracy, but also I think we'll begin to see this in other countries. So short term, I think long term, if I were a betting man, I'd be putting money on democracy.
Let me two-finger on that so Mike can have the last word. I think I also spend a lot of my day with young people, and I do see an increase in political engagement, and that is wonderful. They are excited and engaged. I think a big thing to watch is, will people be politically engaged for the sake of only their party and their issues, or will people be politically engaged to strengthen our system? Those are two very different things, and they're equally important. And I don't want to say that either is more important, but we need a level playing field, a good, well-kept, mowed playing field. I'm a soccer mom, so I can say that. You need a good field for 2 teams to be able to compete. And so we need to be investing in that playing field, in the scaffolding of our democracy, in good electoral systems, in well-run caucuses, in things like that, so that everyone can compete for their own system. And so as my students are also raising their hands saying, yeah, I'm getting engaged, I encourage them to say, yes, get engaged for whatever issue, candidate, party you want, but get engaged in making our system function as well as it can so that you can advance your issues. And that's going to be an important part of this process.
Well, I certainly feel that the future of democracy is bright. And I think it's and I say that because of people. One of the things at Freedom House that we do, people know us to the extent they know us about our reports. But we are also doing a lot of work on the ground in countries like Venezuela and South Africa and other countries around the world, too numerous to mention, of supporting human rights defenders. And these people are so inspiring. They're fighting for democracy. They're fighting for human rights. And I keep thinking about Hong Kong as something that just, to me personally, you know, one of the probably the greatest privileges I had as the president of Freedom House was these young activists. They're now famous in a way, Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, a number of others. They came to Capitol Hill in the fall to basically lobby the US Congress to impose this Hong Kong Democracy Act, which would impose sanctions on the Chinese and Hong Kong officials that were repressing democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. And these are kids that are, I mean, literally, they started in the so-called umbrella revolution when they were teenagers, and now they're like in their early 20s. They are fearless. Mm-hmm. They are putting stuff out on the internet. You know, they are then going back to Hong Kong. They're doing this at great personal risk and they look to the United States for inspiration. You know, they're waving the American flag and singing, you know, the Star-Spangled Banner in the streets of Hong Kong. 3 million people who are, you know, against essentially totalitarian rule, and it's just very inspiring. And so that's what inspires me about the future of democracy, because you have no one who is agitating, unless they're paid by them, for the future of autocracy. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're doing that under pressure. So when people are given the choice, and so I'm optimistic.
So then in the spirit of democracy, let's open it up to questions from the crowd. So yeah, let's start over here.
I would be interested in your thoughts on the American embargo against Cuba. It's now in its 7th decade. I guess its purpose was to bring down Castro, which of course never happened, but it has relegated the Cuban people to more than 6 decades of poverty. They can't even get needed medicines. Do you see any hope for that being eliminated?
So Chris, this sounds like.
Okay. Full disclosure, I worked on Obama's embargo loosening measures. In fact, wrote the memo that justified it. So a couple things. You're right in the sense that it's, you know, you would think a policy that has gone on for 60 years that's failed to produce desired outcome, someone would start to think, maybe this isn't working. As Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly, expecting a different result. It's an insane policy. There are a couple problems here. The first is the embargo is law. Thanks to a 1992 law that was then tightened up in 1997, it will take an act of Congress to change the embargo. Unfortunately, we could argue with the constitutionality of it, but unfortunately no one's ever challenged it. The second issue is obviously, as we see right now with the Trump administration, this boils down to politics in Florida. It's 29 electoral votes, which Trump won and Obama won twice, which explained his willingness to sort of push the envelope a little bit on the embargo. As Obama demonstrated and had been demonstrated through work I had done, there is scope for executive action to liberalize the embargo, and that's in fact what Obama did on December 17th, 2014. Unfortunately, we've gone backwards. We've gone backwards because, for a number of reasons, but largely, again, electoral politics, in which we've reimposed the embargo, reduced flights. Cuban Americans, they can't even go back and visit their relatives multiple times. There are limits on how much they can send to the island to keep their relatives alive. So let me put it this way. The embargo isn't going to change under this administration, largely for electoral politics. It probably won't be lifted as law because it will take an act of Congress, and this is a Congress that has difficulty passing even more sensible legislation, if you will. I think under a Democratic administration, I think there's a lot of, as we've demonstrated, there's a lot of scope for changing the embargo. The idea, I'll be perfectly frank, the idea is to hollow out the embargo from within, to create a set of interests that are so powerful that it can never really be fully reimposed. We didn't get there. But I think it will eventually change. It has to change. We already saw some seeds of change, even in the 2 years that Obama had liberalized the embargo in terms of
Obama went to Cuba and spoke about human rights on live TV to Cubans for the first time ever. He met with Cuban dissidents in the US Embassy. Changes were made, and the Cubans themselves, hardliners within Cuba, the regime, hated that. We struck a nerve for once in terms of freedom in Cuba that's been rolled back. I think if there's, I don't mean to sound partisan, but I think for right now, nothing's going to happen because of the need for those 29 electoral votes. I mean, basically, Florida's going to determine the next election. I mean, there's obviously Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, but Florida is going to be key. We'll see. I actually think, personally, I think the Trump administration has gone so far in extending this embargo that it's going to flip a number of Cuban American voters to vote Democrat, which wouldn't have before. If that happens, I would look to see the embargo being liberalized. I would also hope to see citizens out there in force and advocating for the change of the embargo. Because the problem is this debate has been driven too much by people who have a specific stake and vision and singular commitment to the embargo, and that just is what has trumped more amorphous public opinion and the lack of complete results. Thank you.
Yes, can you speak to the effect of globalization on democracy, and if you think it has declined democracy, advanced democracy, or has it declined or advanced populism, or had no effect on either?
When you say globalization of democracy, what do you mean by that?
I mean, has globalization affected democracy?
I see.
What are your thoughts about globalization and its effects?
I see. Yep. So if I can jump in on that, I would say that it has in largely positive, but also in some negative ways. So I think the fact that you have higher degrees of connectivity around the world, so globalization of technology and information exchange, has allowed people to realize what the changes are that are going on around the world and have been able to connect in ways that they never have been and have been able to have a globalization of ideas. At the same time, other forces, and some of them I mentioned before, like the movement of people, the displacement because of the changes in what the global market looks like, has caused some displacement of people, not just geographic displacement, but displacement within their societies, displacement from their traditional way of life or displacement from their traditional economic sources that has left some people dissatisfied and has opened space for populist leaders. So I think it's a net positive, but I don't think that it's all positive or all negative. I think that there have been factors within globalization that have worked for and against democracy.
I asked that question because we looked at the United States at this point. The counties of 3,000 counties in the United States that have 2/3 of the GNP, and we're trying to elect officials that are democratic. And so I think, to my view, the next election is going to be a lot about how we deal with the effects of globalization on those states that you mentioned, Wisconsin,
Yeah.
Can I just say quickly, I'm reading a book right now from a colleague at Chatham House, Matt Goodwin, about nationalist populism. It argues that, much as Nicole was saying, it's had positive and negative effects. On the one hand, globalization has helped spread and diffuse democratic values and respect for democracy and democratic norms at the high water mark of democracy internationally in the 1990s. But what has happened also is economically, it's caused both through automation, both through trade, both even through the communication of sort of different lifestyles. It's created a sense of dislocation and frustration and economic disjuncture. So I think it's been positive and negative, to reflect what she says. And I think right now we're sort of seeing the negative trend, despite what Thomas Friedman's rather sunny, optimistic little Lexus on the olive tree wanted us to believe a couple decades ago.
And I do think we have to parse out what is actually going on, be honest about it. Some of the things like automation are not singularly because globalization. I do think that, and this is where we get into the issue of individual agency, that a good leader, I think, would step into this space and say, this is what's happening. We have real economic pain in very clear places in our country. Here's why. Not blaming but saying it is automation, it is these other factors, and here's how we are going to strengthen those people who have a real pain point right now, because that's what responsible leadership is about. And so I do think that there's some factors in globalization, but a part of being a leader of either party, either in any way, whether congressional or executive branch, is to say we recognize that these are realities, this is why it is, and we are going to address these factors, some of which are out of our control, some of which are choices that we've made.
Mike, did you want to jump in on that?
I think this conversation touches upon an issue that I think about, that some of us in the sort of pro-democracy community don't think about enough deeply or argue about, which is just the economic roots of some of these issues. And I certainly think that the economic discontent, on both sides of the Atlantic in the wake of like the 2008 financial crisis, really played a big role in some of the populist movements, both here and overseas, that we've been talking about. So I just think that's a good question, and thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. We'll repeat.
In the course of this discussion, there have been two very unsound assumptions that I might really make with regard to testing. The first assumption is that we are a democratic nation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this does not conform with the study, for example, released by Benjamin Page and Mark Nealon a few years ago, that found that in a survey of 1,779 policies, 76% of the time, the elite, the top 10% of the economy, is very seriously restricted, as opposed to more than 90%. So how do you square this assumption with facts? The second assumption is that we are a torchbearer of democracy, and this is somehow different in historical trend. How do you reconcile that with the fact of our coup d'etats in 1953, Iran in 1954, in Guatemala, for us, support of Saddam Hussein in the 80s, or our interference in the Russian election 20 years prior to their interference in ours in 1956, or our support of al-Sisi in Egypt in the aftermath of the Arab Spring since 2013 is now billions of dollars a day. Or even the perception of the world, which found that in a Gallup survey, 24% of the world overwhelmingly says that the United States is the leading threat to world peace. How do you reconcile this opinion with the standard policy?
Well, I'll just say briefly, look, I prefaced my remark about the U.S. by saying, and you've given me more examples, we're a flawed democracy.
I have to say those are criminal acts.
Yeah, but let me just say, I think you have a legitimate question, and we've been a flawed democracy, in a variety of different ways. The way that I think about it is that, we had a big blot on our democracy for almost our entire history, starting with slavery and then with Jim Crow. That really wasn't erased until after the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, I think the only thing I can say is that I think democracy is a process. It's a process of, it's not where anyone achieves nirvana once and then it's done. Mm-hmm. It's a really difficult process of moving forward in the right direction. And I would just say, for all the flaws that you find in the United States, some of which I would agree with, the fact is that people, this great mass movement of people around the world, people want to come to the United States to live here. They don't want to go to China. They don't want to go to Russia. They don't want to go to some of these other countries. I think that's telling you something about the kind of people are voting with their feet about where they want to live. And so I take your point, but I also think, with respect, that if the United States were to really withdraw from the world and not engage in the kind of the fight over democracy, I think that would be really bad for the world. And I think what's incumbent upon us is that I think we need to do a better job of this. We need to articulate better policies to support democracy. At Freedom House, as an example, we do not, try to impose our ideas on our partners on the ground. We are listening to them. We are listening to people who live in South Africa or Lithuania or wherever. We are listening to them of what they think that they'd like to. We want to be supportive, but democracy has to be fought and earned for by the people who live in those countries. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying I respect the question, but I kind of disagree a little bit with the premise.
If I could just add to that too, I said earlier that democracy is a system. It is not a guarantee that all of the outcomes or all of the behavior of the people in that system will always be democratic. It is actually the system that gives us a process to rein in the worst of who we are and allow the best of who we are to flourish. I will not, as an African American, sit and say that the United States has had a track record that has been perfect. I mean, Mike just named significant portions, and there are many other ones about women's voting rights and many other minority populations that in our own country have been highly, highly problematic. But that has stood alongside of the ideals and the institutions which have allowed us to change those worst of who we have been at different times. And that is what gives me the confidence, because we have the infrastructure, that scaffolding, the documents, the institutions, the civil society, the rule of law to do that, to make the changes. And when we have problematic outcomes, we have the ability to change them. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. It's extraordinarily difficult, but that's what makes us a democracy. We have that scaffolding in place to do that. The United States does not have a spotless track record overseas either. Everything you've named is 100% true. But what is also true is the fact that the United States was the country, when we were doing many of those other things, that also did say, tear down this wall, that has stood time and time again with many, many countries. And the reason that Hong Kong activists are going to the streets, they're not going to the streets and waving the flag of any other countries. It is because the United States has a track record. It is not because it has a perfect track record. And one of the things which I think we need to do better is to speak honestly about that, to say it's the values that we are supporting in other people is not because we've done it perfectly, but because those values are the best ones around. And as we seek to live into those and look to change our failures, that's what we seek to support where other people want them. So again, not a perfect track record at home by any means or abroad, but it is the continued stepping into those values that requires us, not from a point of rightness, but a point of you either speak well about it or you're silent, and silence isn't an option.
Can I just actually, one point I wanted to make just contextually for this group about Freedom House. So one thing that I'm very proud about Freedom House is when we do our reports every year, we are not a group that only looks at what's happening in Turkey or Venezuela or Russia or China. We have a chapter every year about the United States, and we rate the United States for how well we live up to the ideals of our democracy. And in fact, over the last 10 years, we have downgraded the scores of the United States because of a whole range of issues. So I think, at least at Freedom House, we're not just pointing the finger abroad, we're also looking at ourselves. And I think that's not always a comfortable position for us politically, but it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I'll just say briefly that American democracy has become more elitist. There is no doubt that it's become more corrupted by money. There is no doubt. That doesn't, though, mean that it means that America perhaps is less democratic. It demonstrates, I think, a lot of the dysfunction and distortions within our democracy. That doesn't mean that we are not democratic. It just points to ills we have to address. The very valid points you just raised in the context of a respectful discussion, I would urge you to raise those in North Korea or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia.
China, Russia.
And then say, okay, it's not a perfect democracy, but we're also not North Korea.
Question. What does the panel think about greed being one of the major causes for breakdowns in democracy?
What was the question?
Greed.
Of greed being a major portion of the breakdown. I mean, I think to Mike's earlier point, corruption is a very significant factor in non-democratic nations, as well as democratic nations, definitively. I think that that is, in part, led by greed. Greed can be defined pretty broadly, but I do think to the extent that it is, in many countries, the greed and the choices of leaders to line their own pockets is a significant threat to democracy, and you see that in a lot of places.
Society, institutions, and then general corporations.
Yeah, I think that greed is a significant factor. I think also, obviously, in corporate decisions, not all of them, but in some corporate decisions that go against democratic values. And I think that's where, as a system, you also have to say, how can we put the checks in place to do that? Where we have elite that are in line with those with those greedy practices, I think that's highly problematic. But that's where you have to push the system to respond to that and limit that where you can.
I'll just say quickly, I mean, democracy is based, and this is where it has also eroded, a sense of community and sense of shared communal responsibility for others. We all see the statistics. In the 1950s, the average pay between a worker and the CEO of a corporation was 1 to 25. Now it's 1 to 300, okay? Greed is very much torn at the social fabric, and it's not just represented in terms of sort of the pay scales for CEOs and major corporations. It's also represented in the way we talk about taxes, the way we talk about investments and public goods, education and the like, and the need for more progressive tax rates. Yes, it has. I think it's very much a threat to democracy in terms of, not just because greed itself, because it's symptomatic of a larger fraying of communal values and commitments and responsibilities. Anyway.
Well, I'm Max. I'm a fourth year here at UVA, so I wanted to thank you all for being at this panel this evening. But I guess one of my questions would, after reading about Freedom House's report on Beijing's global megaphone, I'd really like to ask the panel, how and what does it look like for American objectives in regions like Vietnam, where we've seen internet censorship, setting up shop of China? What do American objectives, how can we combat against China's really mission trying to censor the internet? And we already saw that with Project Dragonfly that got terminated last year. What could we do in the region to work with our partners, and what does that look like? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start by saying I think that we have to, at home, uphold our values in dealing with China. You know, you all have watched the story about the general manager of the Houston Rockets, who made a comment on the internet about supporting the Hong Kong protests. And he was basically shut down by the National Basketball Association. You had a lot of very prominent players, including LeBron, backing off that. And that's like precisely the wrong message to be sending. That, we should not be allowing China to be infringing our free speech rights. And I think, there's been a lot of interesting reporting recently about, some of the things that college universities are doing to and I don't know the story here at UVA, but others who have sometimes not always upheld academic values for interest in keeping good relations with China. I was very proud that I was very impressed with, as a counterpoint, of Columbia University, which hosted the president of Taiwan for a public, for a speech with students when she came on a transit trip through New York in July, even though Columbia has obviously a lot of interest in China, but the president of Columbia is a big free speech person, and he said, no, we're gonna let her have her say here. So it's not a complete answer to your question. It's more complicated than I can do, but I certainly think that as we have more interaction with the Chinese government and more intertwining, we have to kind of stand up for our values. That's one thing I would say.
I agree.
So given the time, I think we have time for one more question.
Mr. Sabatini and Mr. Abramowitz, you both mentioned Venezuela during the discussion, and I'm curious what you think, if you think there will be any movement in terms of American foreign policy towards Venezuela. Of course, the president of Venezuela, Guaido, appeared during the State of the Union, but there's been a stalemate for the past year and a half between the rival presidents in the country. Will we see movement from the United States towards Venezuela, and will the crisis resolve itself in a reasonable amount of time?
I would defer to
Thanks,
Chris,
Mike.
because he's our Latin American expert on the panel.
First of all, let me say that it's difficult for us to get our mind around the scale of the disaster in Venezuela. As Mike said, it is not just a repressive autocratic regime. It is a complete state collapse. It's a humanitarian crisis in which 4.8 million people have fled. The economy is contracted by 2/3 since 2013, not because of U.S. sanctions, but because of failed economic policies, although I will get to the U.S. sanctions in a second. And the government and the military have become effectively embedded in all sorts of illicit activities, everything from gun running to narcotics trafficking to human trafficking to money laundering. This is something that is really unprecedented within our hemisphere, and we will be dealing with the consequences of this for a very, very long time. And there's no sort of roadmap out. Now, will we be seeing a change in U.S. policy towards Venezuela? No. I know we don't have much time, so I'll make it quick. Basically, this administration believed what the Venezuelan opposition, of the hardline opposition for a very long time, had been selling, which was that this government wasn't going to last long. It was only going to take a little nudge and it would collapse, which actually was a complete contradiction to their claims that there were 18,000 Cuban advisors advising the Venezuelan government, which isn't true, which they claim both. The problem is they sort of bought into the line that it was just going to be a matter of an easy path of watching this government tumble. And so when the National Assembly declared Juan Guaido the Democratic interim president, after what was a completely failed or fraudulent election that re-elected Maduro, the U.S. government went all in. They went all in thinking, all it's going to take is a little nudge and we're going to get Maduro out of power. And so they doubled down on sanctions. They imposed oil sanctions, which is they played all their cards at once. They have nothing left, short of maybe putting a blockade around Venezuela, which would be a disaster, or short of even that Trump has openly mused about this, a military intervention, which would be nothing short of an out-and-out disaster, which he won't do. It's just pure bluster, because a president that has promised to take the U.S. out of foreign engagement in an election year is not about to put U.S. boots on the ground in Venezuela, because it's not going to be, Mr. Trump may not know this, but Venezuela is a large country of 28 million people with jungles and forests and mountains and so on. It's not going to be, this isn't Grenada, okay? Which was before your time, but it was a tiny island the U.S. invaded when I was in college. So the problem is that we played all of our cards. We don't know what to do. Bolton, the former national security advisor, the now subpoenaed, not subpoenaed witness in the Senate, promised that his days were numbered. And Trump also said that Maduro is going to go down. He's now backed by the Russians. The Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, was just visiting Maduro. He's basically selling illegally mined gold to the Turks. We've put him firmly in the camp, much as the way our Cuba sanctions did, put him firmly in the camp of the rogue nations. And I think we completely underestimated both the support of other rogue nations for Maduro just to spite the United States, and the willingness of Maduro to inflict incalculable harm on his own population. There's no other policy for the U.S. to play. All that's left is for us to talk tough. And we will continue to talk tough because, again, Florida and its 29 electoral votes. There's a neighborhood outside Miami called Doral. There's so many Venezuelans that have left, mostly upper and middle class Venezuelans, they now call it Dorazuela, because it's Venezuela in Florida. They will vote for whoever talks tough. Sometimes it doesn't matter whether you're effective, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela. It matters whether you're virtue signaling, whether you're sending the right signal. That's all that Trump will be doing. There'll be no policy change. I wish there could be. There's not.
So that's a little bit of a pessimistic note.
Okay, well, I'm not the pessimistic one, I swear.
But I hope
I'm
we've
saying this in
left you
class.
with enough shoots of green in the field
There
of
are many
democracy
shoots.
to leave you with some optimism today. So to close, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on such a nasty evening. And a round of applause for our panelists.
Thanks.
Thank you.